Everyone. Welcome to the first edition of the VBA 2022 Practitioner Education Series. This is the second session of the three-part webinar series on developing plumbing performance solutions. Today's presentation will be about the engagement of stakeholders in the development of plumbing performance solution. Our presenter is Neville Campbell. In addition, Warren James and Ross Marshalsea will assist with answering some of your questions. Neville, Warren and Ross are VBA Senior Technical Advisors within the Technical and Regulation Plumbing team. They have combined many years of industry experience and knowledge and have put together this presentation for you tonight. I am Suada Ramic, Manager Technical Services, managing technical and regulation building and plumbing teams. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which our head office is situated, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We appreciate their love of and for country, and we respect their care and sustainability of this amazing land we all call home. Through our plumbing programs and industry engagement, we frequently hear from practitioners that they would like to know more about the performance-based plumbing code and how it applies to their work. It's also a topic that is often misunderstood by many across the plumbing and building sectors. Today, we will be focusing on the stakeholder engagement phase of developing a plumbing performance solution. Before we begin, I would like to make a note that this session is being recorded, and a link to this presentation will be made available on our website, where you can also find a link to previous VBA webinars. We have set time aside at the end of this presentation for questions. However, I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and encourage you to type your questions there throughout the presentation. We will attempt to address as many of your questions in the time available. You can also vote and comment on the questions that you are most interested in. Today, for the first time, we will be conducting live polls, which will automatically appear on your screens for you to participate in. Your feedback is also very important. So after the presentation, you will be sent to a short survey. We value any feedback you wish to provide about this presentation or other suggested future webinar topics. When thinking about how best to convey the important information of the performance-based plumbing code, the Technical and Regulation team have developed a three-part series on plumbing performance solutions. In the previous webinar, we introduced the legislative framework and walked you through the documents and processes that govern the design and installation of plumbing work in Victoria. In today's session, you will be guided on the design and approval pathway for plumbing performance solutions, including stakeholder engagement, design, and documentation. Now, I would like to welcome Neville Campbell to present today's session. Thanks, Neville.
The objectives of this webinar are to provide guidance on how a performance solution is achieved, the mandatory process that must be used to demonstrate the performance requirements, including the relevant stakeholders in the performance-based design brief process, and how to record a performance solution on a compliance certificate. What is a performance solution? A performance solution is a compliance option under the Plumbing Code of Australia. In our previous webinar, we examined the plumbing regulatory framework and the options for compliance. We looked both at deemed to satisfy provisions and performance solution pathways as a means of demonstrating compliance with the PCA performance requirements. In this session, we will focus on the performance solution pathway and the engagement of relevant stakeholders in the performance-based design brief process. Performance solution is a method of complying with the performance requirements other than a deemed to satisfy solution and is unique for each individual situation. As promised by SWADA, here are some polls. So we'll start early. So what is a performance solution? Some really good numbers coming through here. Some people with a sense of humour as well, which is great to see. Okay, we'll stop the poll there. And we'll share the result. So what is a performance solution? Performance solution is a performance-based means of demonstrating compliance which caters for non-DTS and innovative designs. Why would I follow a performance solution pathway? As outlined in our previous webinar, innovative design and technology and construction practices continually evolve. The standards and legislation that govern these must also evolve, and it's fair to say that many design considerations that were once a performance solution have entered the standards as common practice. Unfortunately, the standards that capture these changes may not deal with every historical practice and cannot be updated for every new and innovative concept. In addition to this, the framework encourages new and replacement plumbing work to be brought up to standard, and there is little provision for like replacement. However, the performance solution pathway provides a method for designers, practitioners to demonstrate that a design will meet the performance requirements of the PCA where there is no deemed to satisfy solution or where replacement work may be inhibited by cost. How is a performance solution achieved? For a performance solution to be achieved, it must demonstrate compliance with all the performance requirements or be at least equivalent to the deemed to satisfy provisions. Performance requirements are the minimum plumbing element that must be achieved and are set out in each section of the PCA along with the deemed to satisfy provision. Where a performance requirement is proposed to be satisfied by a performance solution, there is a mandatory process that must be followed. The steps to the process are outlined in the PCA at A2.2 number 4 and include preparation of a performance-based design brief in consultation with the relevant stakeholders, carrying out an analysis using one or more of the assessment methods listed at A2.2 number 2 as proposed by the performance-based design brief, evaluation of results from analysis against the acceptance criteria in the performance-based design brief, and preparation of a final report that includes all performance requirements and or deemed to satisfy provisions, identification of all assessment methods used, and details of the performance-based design brief process, including confirmation of the performance requirements have been met, and the details of conditions or limitations, if any exist, regarding the performance solution. The Australian Building Codes Board, or ABCB, have published some guidance materials such as the performance solution process and the evidence of suitability handbooks, which further explain the process. And there's a link to that at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So what is a performance-based design brief and what does it include? A performance-based design brief, or PBDB, is defined as the process and the associated report that defines the scope of work for the performance-based design analysis, the technical basis for the analysis, and the criteria for acceptance of any relevant performance solution as agreed by the stakeholders. The purpose of a performance-based design brief is to record fundamental activities and outcomes of the performance-based design process, including key stakeholder negotiations and agreements, and to identify all critical activities and outcomes. The level of detail required to complete a brief should be proportionate to the complexity of the performance solution being developed. It's poll time again. What is a performance-based design brief? Okay, we'll end the poll at that one. Share some results. That great numbers coming through. Really pleased to see that a lot of people are picking tailored cargo pants. Made my day. Of course, what is a performance-based design brief? A performance-based design brief is the process and the associated report that defines the scope of work for analysis, the technical basis for analysis, and the criteria for acceptance. So who are the stakeholders in a performance-based design brief and what role do they play? The key stakeholders in the development of a performance-based design brief may vary with the scope of work and other factors such as whether the work requires a building permit or not. Depending on the complexity of the brief, the relevant stakeholders may be identified from the scoping attributes of the proposed solution and the relevant parts of the building that are subject to the performance-based design approach. On completion, the performance-based design brief will become a platform upon which the proposed design is constructed. As the development of a performance solution is an iterative process, the engagement of further stakeholders may become necessary where further technical and regulatory considerations are identified. Stakeholders often include the building owner or owner's representative, such as an owner's corporation or Department of Housing, the project manager, the plumber, the builder, design practitioners such as architects and draftspersons, engineers such as civil, structural or hydraulic, an appropriate authority such as the VBA, the relevant building surveyor, a water authority, council planner, WorkSafe, environmental protection authority, and specialists such as consultants or product manufacturers. Stakeholders can provide advice within the scope on any crossover between trades and risk mitigation strategies. The stakeholders play a crucial role in collaboration in providing relevant information to support the performance solution. The process will require collaboration and negotiation, and ultimately stakeholders will need to agree on the appropriate acceptance criteria and assessment methods to achieve a mutually based, performance-based outcome. Excuse me. Stakeholders will vary with each individual solution, so collaboration is essential. For this reason, one person should be selected to manage the brief. Poll time again. What role does the VBA play? Sorry, who is a stakeholder in a performance solution? We'll end that there. Some really great numbers coming through. Okay, so who could be a stakeholder in a performance solution? Of course, any or all of the above could be. So what role does the VBA play in a plumbing performance solution? The VBA is the appropriate authority for plumbing work in Victoria. An appropriate authority is defined as the relevant authority with the statutory responsibility to determine a particular matter. However, under Victoria's self-certification framework, a licensed plumber can legally certify their own work without the regulator's input. And the VBA may choose to be involved at their discretion through the risk-based audit and inspection process. This means that if the VBA should choose to audit a plumbing installation that is installed under a performance solution, the authorised officer would not assess the design, but instead would assess whether the performance solution process has been followed. This is likely to include assessing the acceptance criteria, assessment methods, confirming that all mandatory PCA requirements have been met, and ensuring that the installation is consistent with the design. Quick one. What role does the VBA play in a performance solution? All right, so I'll end that there and we'll share these results again. So what role does the VBA play in a performance solution? The VBA will not assess the design, but will ensure that the PCA process has been followed and that the installation is consistent with the agreed design. So what are acceptance criteria and assessment methods? Acceptance criteria are the foundations on which a performance solution is built. Acceptance criteria is the metric agreed between the stakeholders that defines what is being measured and what is an acceptable level of evidence required to demonstrate what is being measured. It is common practice to use a benchmark to quantify the performance of a proposed design. One method is to compare a design that meets the deemed to satisfy provisions against the proposed design and directly comparing the data. For example, an existing box gutter may need to be replaced and the design is not consistent with today's requirements due to the change of direction only. However, when we compare the current DTS solution and the actual design of the installation, we find that the existing gutter was larger than it needed to be and can easily accommodate the change in direction and still exceed the DTS design flow. In column 1, we can see that in column 1 of our example, we can see that the affected DTS provision is the need for a box gutter to be straight. In column 2, we can see how this may affect the installation if the rest of the design were equal to the DTS. In columns 3, 4, and 5, we can see that the existing installation exceeds the requirements of the affected DTS provision in column 6, the affected DTS provision, and in column 6 we can see how this has been confirmed. Detailed benchmarking may also be considered an acceptable assessment method. However, benchmarking may not be possible where a design is outside the scope of the DTS provisions. Once the acceptance criteria has been agreed, the applicable PCA assessment method will also need to be agreed. In most jurisdictions, it is essential that the appropriate authority agrees with the assessment methods being used. However, due to the Victorian self-certification system, this is not the case for plumbing. The PCA provides for 4 assessment methods, and any one or more may be used to assess a performance solution. The assessment methods are evidence of suitability in accordance with Part A5, verification method, which is listed in the relevant section of the PCA, or that is acceptable to the appropriate authority, expert judgment, which means the judgment of an expert who has the qualifications and experience to determine whether a performance solution or deemed to satisfy a solution complies with performance requirements, and comparison with the DTS provisions such as detailed benchmarking. How do I prepare a performance-based design brief? The performance-based design brief is described as a process for which there are 4 stages. The stages include scope, communicate with the stakeholders, document the relevant data, and stakeholder sign-off on the agreed brief. Stage 1 of the performance-based design brief requires documenting the scope of the proposed solution. This will involve preparing a client brief and identifying the technical and regulatory requirements that apply to the proposal. In essence, this means explaining to the client that certain parts of the design do not comply with the deemed to satisfy provisions, and what are the requirements from a technical and regulatory perspective. Stage 2 of the process is to communicate with the key stakeholders. This is essential in the performance-based design brief process and will involve identifying who the stakeholders are. Who the stakeholders are will depend on the attributes and parameters of the project and the parts of the building or regulatory requirements that are impacted by the performance-based design. For example, where a performance solution is proposed for a non-DTS roof drainage system in a new building, one key stakeholder would be the relevant building surveyor for the purpose of the building permit. However, if a non-DTS roof drainage system was being replaced like for like in an existing building, there may be no building permit requirements and consequently no RBS involved. In the second scenario, the key stakeholders may simply be the plumber and the owner of the building, or may include stakeholders such as a heritage or fire authority. In either scenario, the owner or the plumber may choose to engage other independent experts, such as an engineer, to ensure that the designs are appropriate. They may also comment on the appropriate verification methods and acceptable criteria. Note that it is a conflict of interest for a person with a regulatory responsibility to assess design aspects when they have contributed to the development of the design. Stage 3 of the process is to document the relevant data. This is where all the agreements are documented, along with any limitations and assumptions, any agreed benchmarks, and the agreed methods of demonstrating conformity. The brief should state who is responsible for providing evidence and confirming that the agreed acceptance criteria has been satisfied. As the stakeholders and the complexity will vary with each performance solution, so too will the relevant data. At a minimum, the data should include the subject building, the scope and basis of proposal, the applicable performance requirements, the agreed acceptance criteria, the applicable assessment processes, the scope of the evidence, and the required documentation and the format of the report format. The final stage of the performance-based design brief is the stakeholder sign-off. Sign-off is required to verify that all stakeholders understand the brief and accept its content. The content of the brief may vary, however, at a minimum, it should include a summary of the proposal, including building type and function, effective height and location of the building, a description and explanation of the proposed solution, the nominated applicable performance requirements, agreed acceptance criteria, and the required scope of supporting evidence, the format and content of the final report, and the acknowledgement of the participants. We've prepared a performance-based design brief. What do we do now? The next step is to carry out an analysis using one or more of the assessment methods listed in the PCA and as agreed in the performance-based design brief. The process of analysis may need to be reviewed if initial outcomes do not meet the agreed acceptance criteria. In some circumstances, it may be necessary to undertake modelling and testing. Next, the results will need to be properly evaluated, as this is a critical component of the performance solution process. Where multiple trials or designs may have been considered and analysed, each iteration of the evidence and the design documents must also be evaluated against the acceptance criteria to ensure that the standard of conformity of the design is properly evaluated. Once the results have been evaluated, it is time to prepare a final report. The report is sometimes referred to as a performance solution report, and its main purpose is to collate all the documentation. It will also provide the VBA with a means of verifying compliance with the performance requirements. The report must also include all performance requirements and/or deemed to satisfy provisions identified as relevant to the performance solution, identification of all assessment methods used, the performance design brief analysis, the performance design brief, analysis carried out, and any necessary modelling and testing, collation and evaluation of results which demonstrate performance with the requirements, and details of conditions and limitations, if any, regarding the performance solution, such as maintenance schedule. On completion of the final report, the plumber can carry out the installation confident in the knowledge that the work is consistent with the performance requirements of the PCA. When the plumbing work has been completed, the plumber should indicate on his compliance certificate that the work has been carried out under a performance solution by putting a tick in the performance solution box under specialty details. So specialty details right there. Next, they need to provide details of the installation, such as what work does a performance solution apply to? The relevant performance requirements, the assessment method used, and the version of the assessment method used, and the version of the PCA used. Copies of the documentation and the compliance certificate should be kept by the practitioner and the property owner for 10 years. Will my insurance cover a performance solution? Ultimately, this is a question for the insurance provider. However, current plumbing insurance provides for consumers to make a claim against the plumbing practitioner's insurance policy in a number of circumstances. While it's a requirement of the Building Act for licensed plumbers to hold the relevant insurance and appropriate level of cover prescribed by the Victorian Government in 2 separate ministerial orders before a plumbing licence can be issued or renewed, a performance solution may carry increased risk for the plumbing practitioner and or the consumer. So it is a good practice for the plumbing practitioner to confirm their level of cover with their insurance provider when contemplating a performance-based design. Now let's work through some scenarios where different stakeholders may be involved. Scenario 1. In this scenario, the site is an established home built in the 1970s, which is owned by a pensioner. The local plumber has been asked to replace the box gutter between the house and the garage. The box gutter is 190 millimetres wide and undersized by today's requirements. But the plumber is confident that it works and it will not overtop given the small catchment area. The plumber advises the owner that the box gutter is narrower than the minimum standard and that altering the roof structure would require some engineered designs and a building permit, which would significantly add to the replacement costs. The plumber explains that he can demonstrate the box gutter works and he proposes certifying the work under a performance solution. In this scenario, there is no trigger for a building permit, no building surveyor involved, and no other relevant stakeholders. The plumber holds a licence in roofing, which enables him to perform plumbing work. Under Victoria's self-certification framework, the design of a roof drainage system is defined as plumbing work, and unlike a building surveyor, there is no legislation that expressly prohibits the plumber from certifying his own design. While the plumber may be competent to design a roof drainage system, where no data can be extrapolated from the DTS provisions, either the plumber or the owner may choose to consult a professional engineer to design the system or confirm that the like-for-like replacement will meet all the performance requirements. Scenario 2, where a plumbing performance solution is proposed to be developed under the Plumbing Code of Australia for a new building, the relevant building surveyor should not accept the performance solution in blind faith and should seek appropriate evidence to satisfy themselves that a performance solution meets the performance requirements of the PCA. Where the performance solution is designed by a plumber, the relevant building surveyor will also need to be satisfied that the plumber has the appropriate qualifications and experience to create the design. In addition to this, the relevant building surveyor should also confirm that the process prescribed by A 2.2 number 4 has been followed and that all performance requirements have been achieved. Scenario 3. As new and innovative building designs become more prevalent, it is often the case for plumbers that they are not involved in the design process and arrive on site at frame stage to find that the support structure of the roof drainage system will not accommodate a DTS design. At this stage, plumbers often feel that they had no choice but to install the roof drainage system to fit the structure or forego the job and risk being perceived as unreliable. The appropriate course of action for the plumbing practitioner would be to assess the roof drainage system while quoting against the approved plans. If a non-DTS design is identified, the plumbing practitioner should not proceed with the construction and instead communicate their findings to the builder and the relevant building surveyor as the appropriate authority. It is incumbent upon the relevant building surveyor to confirm whether the design will be certified under a deemed to satisfy provision or a performance solution pathway. Where a performance solution was not indicated on the approved plans, the relevant building surveyor will need to be satisfied that the performance solution has been achieved and issue an amended building permit to reflect the performance solution pathway. Once the amended permit has been issued, the plumbing practitioner can confidently proceed with the roof drainage installation in accordance with the performance solution design. Going forward, the VBA's building audit team will encourage early intervention by looking at roof drainage through their audit agenda. Scenario 4. In this scenario, the site is an existing townhouse in a significant streetscape. The plumber has been asked to replace a galvanised rain head that is rusted out with a contemporary rain head design of a similar size. The plumber is aware that the contemporary rain head is not a deemed to satisfy design and suggests to the owner that it could be certified as a performance solution. In this scenario, the appearance of the building is likely to be subject to a heritage overlay under a planning scheme. In scoping the work and identifying the technical and regulatory requirements, the local council planner would be considered a relevant stakeholder, as there is no building permit and therefore their approval would not be captured through a building surveyor's oversight. Scenario 5. In this scenario, the site is an existing home with an extensive vegetable garden. The owner wants to expand the garden to be more self-sufficient and plans to install a rainwater tank to water the garden. To maximise the yard space, the tanks will be located on a combined easement at the back of the block and filled via a charged stormwater system. As a charged stormwater system is outside the scope of the DTS provisions, the plumber intends to certify the design through a performance solution pathway. As there is no building permit in this scenario, the acceptance should be sought from the owner of the easement for the placement of the tank and associated plumbing work. However, if the site was subject to a building permit, the owner of the easement would not be considered a stakeholder in the performance solution, as their approval would be captured through the relevant building surveyor's oversight. Now we'll reflect on what we've covered in this session. In this session, we've looked at what a performance solution is, why we might choose the performance solution pathway, how a performance solution is achieved. We've looked at the mandatory process that must be used to demonstrate a performance requirement, including developing a performance-based design brief. Analysis and evaluation results and preparing a final report. We've looked at how to record a performance solution on a compliance certificate and provided some scenarios where different stakeholders may be involved. Now let's answer some frequently asked questions. At this point, I'll turn it over to Warren and Ross.
Yeah, hi all. The reason the frequently asked questions come about because a few of them are coming through in the chat, and we're trying to address as many as possible, and that's why we thought we'd go this road to explain this. This is a common question. What does expert judgment mean? Expert judgment means the judgment of an expert who has the qualification experience to determine whether a performance solution or a deemed to satisfy solution complies with the performance requirements. So Neville's discussed the performance requirements in the NCC. Obviously, the qualification experience of that person designing the performance solution should be related to the relevant field. Another term for is also a recognised expert, which means a person with qualifications and experience in the area of plumbing and drainage in question, as determined by the appropriate authority. A licensed plumbing practitioner that is licensed by the VBA in the relevant plumbing field can also be deemed as an expert judgment or recognised expert. If expert judgment is used as one of the assessment methods, like with all other assessment methods, there will still be the requirement or the need for appropriate documentation to support the performance solution. This could include evidence to demonstrate why the person's a recognised expert, such as what type of qualification and experience they have. I actually skipped that. Sorry, what experience do they have in this particular field and type of building they've been designed? what calculation, analysis, testing, modelling and evaluation that's been carried out by the recognised person, and any other relevant information to support the performance solution. The VBA may determine if the recognised expert is appropriate for a performance solution. Happy to elaborate that further later on, but yeah, we're over to question 2. Who at the VBA signs off a performance solution in regards to whether it will work or not? Under the current requirements of the plumbing regulatory framework in Victoria, a plumber can certify their own plumbing work as it's been for many years now. Basically, the responsibility sits with the plumbing practitioner in the absence of a building surveyor. The VBA does not sign off on a performance solution in relation to whether it will work or not, as this is contradictory to our role as administrating the plumbing laws. If the VBA was to sign off on an approved performance solution and then later on have a compliance or enforcement role, that would be a conflict of interest and it would result in us regulating ourselves. This is why building surveyors involved in designing performance solutions cannot approve them. It must be done by another building surveyor. Question 3, is there a conflict of interest for a plumber to install the plumbing work if they has also designed it? As Neville's touched on throughout the presentation, under the Victoria's self-certification framework, a licensed plumber can legally design and install plumbing work that they are qualified in. Under the performance solution pathway, the plumber would still need to gain the agreement of the stakeholders, including the building owner prior to installation. So in other words, your building owner may seek an independent party as such as an engineer or so on. So I thought I'd add that in. Question 4, what performance solution documentation is required for review by a building surveyor or a plumbing inspector at the appropriate authority? A performance-based design brief with all the relevant calculations, testing, modelling or comparisons to the current deemed to satisfy requirements and the alignment to the performance requirements of the relevant section of the PCA. Basically, that's what's required. This information forms part of the final performance solution report and should be made available to the building surveyor and the plumbing inspector when required. Licensed plumbers should also attach the final report documentation when lodging their compliance certificate, and there is an attachment feature available in the VBA 360 system for your convenience.
Thanks, Warren. One thing I just want to add to that, if plumbing work certified under performance, you happen to come up for audit, it's not the standards that the auditor is going to assess it against, it's the design, the approved design. So that's what they'd be looking at. Okay, time for another poll. Okay, so we'll end the poll there. Some really good numbers there. Good to see so many plumbers have joined us tonight. That's great.
Thank you, Neville. It was a great presentation. There is quite a bit of information there, and in addition to the most frequent questions and answers. I'm hopeful the information presented tonight has added some value and overall understanding of performance solution process and understanding of the important part that stakeholders engagement plays in the process. So I just to acknowledge that there is about was 436 participants. It's a really good turnout, and we have quite a few questions. In terms of time, I think we got about perhaps less than 15 minutes for questions. There are there would be quite a few questions as well on posted. I understand that some of the questions already have been answered online, and we are prepared to perhaps provide some other questions live, but perhaps due to the time or limitations, we may not be able to answer all of your questions today. However, for the purpose of today's session, we will try to focus on questions that are relevant to the topics that we presented today. We understand that you may have more detailed questions. You may have posted, we understand you may have more detailed questions about specific process and or practical examples. So we'll use any questions you may have posted to help us refine future sessions, and we encourage you to attend the future webinar series. The most common and most critical questions that we may not be able to cover tonight, we will attempt to answer post this webinar and publish them on the VBA website under the Q&A session. Now I will call on our technical team members to join us to assist answering your questions. Neville, along with Warren James and Ross Marshalsea, and I think Team Train is here as well to assist. Welcome, Warren, Ross, and Train. We can start with the questions. I'm happy for you to select or go in the order, or I think there are already some questions unmarked to be answered live. We can perhaps start with that.
Thanks, Wada. I see Tin's marked a couple that he'd like to answer live. Tin, did you want to fire away?
Oh, thanks, Neville. I marked it as that those should be answered live by someone on the panel, but that's fine. But yeah, I think the first one, which was a question, I'll just read the question. The question was, please convey with absolute clarity whether a performance solution could be written for issues covered in Standards Australia HB 39. We already know that 3500 Part 3 and NCC. So I'll take that question as to mean whether you could do a performance solution on the requirements of HB 39. So the answer to that is actually no. And so the reason for why you can't do that is HB 39 is a reference standard under the plumbing regulations. It's not actually a prescribed standard in the PCA. So with prescribed standards under the plumbing the performance solution pathway option is only available for requirements under the PCA. The requirement to follow HB 39 is actually not a requirement of the PCA, it's actually a requirement of the plumbing regulations. So that's why you can't use this particular method for HB 39. So having said that, there are other options available, such as a plumbing modification application, and we have seen that done in the past for other types of kind of plumbing requirements. That's only in the plumbing regulations.
Thanks, Tim.
I'm happy to answer one if there's.
Yep, carry on, Mark.
Yeah, this is a very relevant question. I've asked the same question myself at times. I'm not sure if it's come from a plumber or who, but it doesn't matter. It talks about a question why the building plans may not have been compliant in the first place when they've been granted as a permit. Now, within this, and I think we sort of made the comment about plumbing work, that pretty much the plumbing installation and sits with the plumber, and the responsibility sits with the plumber. But in saying this around the building permit installation too, quite often, look, not everything goes from plan to application, and levels may change, design may change, things change on the job, and this is where it's important in the industry that you communicate this back through your builder and your building surveyor in that case, because it may trigger an amendment to the building permit or so on. So I've sort of asked the same question myself in a while, but it does happen from time to time, and I've been pretty blunt with practitioners. You put that metal gutter down and it's not compliant, then either go the other way. If you can't do deemed to satisfy, go the performance solution and basically provide the calculations to support it. So I hope I answered that for there, but yeah. Let's see if there's anyone else wants to jump in, Ross or someone.
I'll jump in quickly. So there's another question. So one of the question was, have insurance companies supplying plumbers insurance agreed to cover variations to Australian standards when performance solutions are implemented? So this was kind of covered briefly in the last webinar as well. And also Neville talked about this in relation to kind of plumbers insurance. The first thing you need to really check is with your actual insurance company to verify, to check whether it is something that can be covered under, because they might have limitations on your potential cover. So it can vary. So that's why there's no yes, no answer, and it does vary, can vary for each person.
Yeah, perhaps if I can pick up on one of the questions I've noticed come up there, and it relates to whether the plumber has to agree with the performance solution. Now, it's a good question, because at the end of the day, it's the expectation that if you have done regulated plumbing work in Victoria, you've got two options for certifying that work. You can say, yes, I've completed the work and I'm going to certify that it meets all the deemed to satisfy requirements. Or if a performance solution is being used to certify the work, well, then the expectation is there that the plumber has agreed to what's in the performance solution. If they're not in agreement with what's being proposed as part of the performance solution, well, then putting it plainly, they'd be a mug to certify the work saying that they agreed to the performance solution, because if that job was audited or if it did fail, the plumber is going to be held liable for the work that they've certified, whether it be through a performance solution or whether it be through the deemed to satisfy pathway. So yes, if you're going to certify, if a plumber is certifying work using a performance solution, the expectation is that they are going to be happy with the design and with the installation of that work.
Thanks, Ross. I'll grab one. What qualifications and experience does a plumber have in advanced water modelling that would obviously be required to undertake advanced consideration of complex box gutter, downpipe, overflow and surcharge provisions? Good question. Under the plumbing regulations, they are legally able to certify their design and certify their own work. They are tested for some certain requirements that they need to meet for designing roof drainage systems. As I've sort of touched on in some of those slides, any of the other stakeholders could engage someone else where they felt that the plumber's the plumber's design may not be appropriate or may not have the skills to meet the performance requirements. Remember, this is an iterative process and there needs to be stakeholder agreement. So everyone involved in it's got an input.
If I could perhaps just take another one. I see there's a question there. Is there a problem data sheet that's available? So I guess, you know, there's an expectation out there as plumbing performance solutions are used as a method of certifying jobs that we can standardise the way that performance solutions are developed. And that's a whole process, as Neville's outlined. And it's indeed the whole purpose of this seminar series, where we've started off talking about the regulatory framework, so people can identify when it is that it's a plumbing performance solution, because it relates specifically to performance criteria that come out of the Plumbing Code of Australia. not to be confused with other performance criteria that might come out of other sections of the National Construction Code. But importantly, there's a set of steps that need to be followed, and indeed Neville's outlined those tonight. And in the final in our series, what we want to do is not only take the steps that we've spoken about tonight, but also take some of the scenarios that have been mentioned tonight and then give you some examples of what it might look like. But there's a key point here. Performance solutions, by their nature, need to be specific to the plumbing work that's being done. There's no cookie cutter approach. There's no easy way of doing this. If you're going to go down the performance solution pathway for whatever reason, you need to have that engagement with the stakeholders, and you need to make sure that you've appropriately documented the outcome. And as I say, it's perhaps an ad from me for the next, or the final in the seminar series about how it is that you might go about documenting some of the scenarios that were presented tonight. So join in next time.
I'll just jump on another one just quickly. I saw in there that someone's asking, I've only presented roof scenarios, and that's correct. That's because it is one of the biggest faults that we come across, and the majority of questions around performance solutions typically revolve around roofing. Any standard under the Plumbing Code of Australia, any reference standard under the Plumbing Code of Australia can be altered by a performance solution. So that includes 3500.2 for drainage.
Are we agreeing with time? Is the time for to pick up one or two more questions before the session ends?
Yeah, no, I suppose I'd like to just make a point. I mean, as right throughout this process, it's an option. It's not necessarily a requirement to do a performance solution. You can still be deemed to satisfy plumber and work within that. So, and look, the reason Neville covered the scenarios, and as he pointed out, it's commonly around roofing, whether we like it or not. And look, that could be because design has changed and things have changed. And but yeah, to be brutally blunt, it's a self-certification system. The installing plumber under that class of work does take responsibility. And so, and as Ross pointed out, I think the whole thing, and I don't think anyone would disagree with this, communication's the key to this from start to finish.
I'll field one more, just because it speaks specifically about an example I've given. In the example of the pensioner with the 190mm box gutter, would the fact that the gutter has performed satisfactorily for the last 30 to 40 years form the major evidence for the performance solution, notwithstanding climate change? Not without other evidence. Simply saying that, well, it's been okay for the last 40 years, there's no real evidence of that. It still needs to be demonstrated. The evidence provided needs to be appropriate. See if we can sneak another quick one in. We've got a few there that are a little bit too complex to answer in the time we've got left. I think we might wrap that up there. Thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, it's really good to see such a big attendance, and that's a good sign that people and the practitioners out there are seeking guidance, interested to know more and understand the process. So, like, our third session, perhaps Neville, you can introduce or announce the third session that's coming pretty much around the corner, I suppose. So we can. Thanks, Swada. Yeah, I do have a little bit more to say. The recording of the session and our feedback survey will be available shortly. I encourage you to fill in the post-event survey as we use this information to decide on future sessions. We hope you can join us for our next session on the 24th of February. And the VBA looks forward to bringing your more educational content in 2022. Thank you all again for joining us, and thanks, team.
Thanks, everyone, for
Thank you.
attending, and good work.